The First World War put the United States on the world stage, where the country has remained into our present time. Originally called the Great War because of the devastation it caused on such a large scale, the First World War was a conflict in which 9 million people around the world lost their lives in the fighting. The war began in July 1914 and ended with the armistice in November 1918. The primary nations in the war were the Allied powers of France, the United Kingdom, and Russia against the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The United States entered the war in April 1917 on the side of the Allies.
In order to understand 20th and 21st century history, you really have to have an understanding of the First World War, because a lot of the campaigns that the United States is involved in today, such as the war in Iraq, is a product of the First World War, and a lot of the political instability in the Middle East is a product of the First World War. The World War II, the rise of Adolf Hitler in the 1920s and the 1930s, is a product of the First World War.
Greater New York and New Jersey across the Hudson River played an outsized role in the war even before the United States joined the fight. This is not surprising, given that New York was a port city on the Atlantic Ocean, with easy access to the shipping lanes to Europe and elsewhere. Shipping and logistics, moving men and materiel from here to there, were integral to the Allied war effort. The United States was officially neutral in the war's early years, and so free to conduct business with both sides. In reality, America did business more on the side of the Allies, shipping, at a price, vast quantities of food and munition to the British and French. New York only became that much more important when the Americans finally joined the fight in spring 1917.
It's very difficult to overstate the importance of New York State, and especially New York City, or what you might call Greater New York City, in the United States' involvement in the First World War.
Thomas Michael Tobin was born in Yonkers, in Westchester County, just north of New York City, on July 6, 1886.
Well, he was my grandfather, and the patriarch of the family for many years. I have the same name, Thomas M. Tobin.
His parents were immigrants from Ireland who had come to the United States around the time of the American Civil War. Many immigrants were coming to the United States in these decades. It was an opportune time for an enterprising young man. Wall Street and the ports of New York City, just minutes away by train, were teeming with energy. Immigrants from across the Atlantic and Americans from across the continent were arriving by the thousands every day in search of the American dream. Tobin attended class irregularly and did not graduate high school. But what he lacked in formal education, he made up for in initiative.
When he was a young man, after having been thrown out of grammar school because when his father died, they removed his sister from the Catholic school. And the Catholic school said, well, if your sister's not going here, you can't either. So they threw him out of school. And at one point, he during the next few years, he rented a trolley car for X dollars, and then charged such and thus for couples to take the trolley car out to a park at the end of Tuckahoe in Yonkers for a picnic during a summer day. And he was that kind of a person who was ambitious to make money and to support his family and so forth.
My grandfather and his sister Mary were orphaned. One family took in Mary, the McPikes, and he went to live with the Coopers. And my grandmother's family, they had also been orphaned, and they lived with the McPikes. So my grandfather's sister and my grandmother lived in the same house, and that's how my grandfather met my grandmother.
He was orphaned at the age of 12. and was uneducated, but nevertheless made his way in life before the First World War, to the point where he was a supervisor of the loading and unloading of ships at the sugar refinery in Yonkers, and became a warden of the Port of New York, which was the predecessor of the Port Authority of New York.
He rose quickly and soon became superintendent of the refinery's shipping department. In 1911, New York Governor John Alden Dix appointed Tobin to the Board of Port Wardens. Greater New York in these years was still a major shipping hub, and managing the waterfront was of important civil and economic consequence. Thomas Michael Tobin was the president of the Board of Port Wardens from 1912 to 1915.
The fact is that he was appointed as a warden of the Port of New York. I think it was in about 1912. The Army experience was a continuation of that, I'd say, and that kind of public service continued throughout his life.
All this experience was why the United States Army sent Thomas Tobin to Saint-Nazaire after President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war in April 1917. When America entered the First World War, Tobin easily could have stayed home. Tobin had married Agnes Crowley in June 1908.
He was about 31 years old with several children, so I doubt that he was drafted. I suspect that because of his specialty, they needed somebody, and he either volunteered or they requested that he serve for a year.
Thomas Michael Tobin was one of the nearly 4.5 million Americans who served in the First World War. He was appointed a first lieutenant in the Quartermaster Corps and was stationed at the French port of Saint-Nazaire and served there from June 1918 until June 1919.
He became the supervisor of loading and unloading ships in one of the major French ports, which supplied war materials to the American forces in Europe at that time.
American soldiers had never been sent abroad in such large numbers before. Approximately 200,000 American troops passed through this one French port city throughout the entire war. Just as crucially, 4,000 tons of war material, everything needed to feed and arm the American expeditionary forces, passed through Saint-Nazaire daily from the time these first Americans arrived through the armistice 17 months later.
Think of how complicated it is to have ships moving across the Atlantic Ocean, trying to evade German submarines all the while. And while you're trying to ship 4,000 tons of material, every day, trying to send thousands and thousands of troops across the ocean. The challenges of keeping that afloat, keeping that ship running, is no small task. And the people who toil away so anonymously, we don't even know who they are.
I actually joined the Marine Corps because I was trying to get away from my computer job. One of the things I told my recruiter was, I'll join the Marine Corps, just make sure I don't get a computer job.
The Marines was one of the options for my age, but it was not an option for me. So I looked into them, I looked into the different branches and what they carried and what that would adapt to my personality best, and the Navy was the best for me. Because at the time, I had no one to be responsible for but for myself, no children. So being away from family, it didn't seem that bad at the time, but it's really, really hard. It's a big sacrifice.
I think the most universal experience for all veterans is like boot camp. You have to go to boot camp and you treat it like a game. No matter what, you go there and nothing what you do other than, becoming a Marine, a soldier, a sailor, or an airman matters at boot camp. And remember that it's these people's job to make you into a service member.
Yeah, day one, I literally cried day one. I was like, what did I get myself into? Like, why did you sign up for this? After that, the first couple of days, I was fine, but I seen a lot of females, like, physically that wasn't able to do the push-ups and things. But when you see the growth later, that those same females that were crying on day one that couldn't do 2 or 3 push-ups at the end, that's doing 50 plus push-ups, because it's a mental thing. It literally is a mental thing. It's physical activity, of course, but it's definitely a mental thing. At the end of it, I appreciate every last one of them, because they prepared me for when I went into the field.
Probably 20%, maybe even less than 20% of the people in Vietnam were actually out humping the rifle in the bushes,
We don't just send people over there to, go take over countries. We have to support anybody that we send over there ourselves.
What does it take to keep a unit, in the field in Afghanistan, to keep the IT running on that? Things we take for granted, like email and Wi-Fi access, keeping all that secure in a war zone. Someone's doing that. Someone's putting in 12, 15-hour days, sleeping next to the server to make sure that if there's a glitch, that 1,000 people don't all of a sudden lose their Wi-Fi. Lives can be at stake. You have to have, good communication. You have to have secure communication out in the field. And it's, these stories that we really wanted to convey, how important it is, and what a thankless task it is, and that there are people who are carrying these duties out.
My father, he was a Navy lieutenant commander at the end of the war. He served as a captain of a destroyer escort, convoying ships between the east coast of the United States through the canal and to the west coast of Chile, transporting, I think, things like gunpowder and supplies and raw materials for conducting the war.
I was an engineer, which is, I believe, one of the hardest jobs, as well as the life of the ship, in my opinion. Everything we do has to do with running the ship, and I was a machinist mate. It consists of operating the elevators, giving the fresh water, the electricity to the ship. We controlled the boilers, which was the main process what moved the ship. Any moving parts, basically. So I feel like the engineers was the hardest working people on the ship, and that's what I was.
I was a tactical network administrator. That means I worked routers, switches, and firewalls in the Marine Corps. I also did IA, which is information assurance, which is computer security. In Afghanistan, I was the administrator for the largest bandwidth hub. The majority of the bandwidth that was going to users in Afghanistan was going through my routers and firewalls.
Again, these are very important tasks, often thankless tasks, often tasks that we don't always think about, but these are the things that really keep a military running.
I think the Marine Corps has a particularly strong sense of culture. As the smallest branch and generally the first branch to go in, generationally, we pass on our sense of culture from, one generation of recruits to the next generation of recruits. The Marine Corps is generally used to working in a smaller numbers. We don't require as much infrastructure or detailed battle plans to go in. We're there, and we're a force that is designed to go in and take control of an area, but we're not a force that is designed to maintain control of an area, which is something that the Army specializes in.
The Navy is prideful to be, one of the longest branches and one of the strongest branches of military. The Marines come through us and from us. Still competition, it's still pride behind, being the Navy. Like you wear that proud, just like the Marines wear their label proud. You still have that pride in you, that hoo-yah.
When we visited him at the farm during the summers, he every evening he'd get dressed for dinner in a pair of khakis and his World War I uniform khaki shirt and a pair of penny loafers and so forth. It was a standard uniform every single evening, and so he continued to enjoy the reminder of his service in the war.
The role of technology in these most recent wars have made them the most safe wars that we've ever fought. There's higher morale in this for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan because people even though they're away, they can still call home and email home with relative ease compared to, I'm sure, what it must have been like before that was available.
All veterans are not doing bad. I've been out since January, and I have my health care, I'm in school, I have my own place. So all veterans aren't doing bad. It's like anything, you know, you go to college, you get a degree, and it's up to you what you do with it afterwards. So I went to the military to better my life, and it's up to me how better my life can be with this experience.
My family was very supportive of me when I got back. Both my immediate family and my extended family. I think a lot of them were surprised by the way in which I changed, which is mostly just, I think I was emotionally much more mature when I got back. I was able to lead people, which is something I was not able to do before. And I had a much stronger sense of responsibility than I did before I left.
Your mindset starts to change about what is important and what's not important. The things that I used to complain about before, I don't longer complain about. But then you still hear people around you complain about those things. So it's just your mindset totally changed. You appreciate so much more things than I did before I left.
He certainly was active after the war. He was a public safety commissioner of Yonkers and active in the Democratic Party. Well, I think it was a continuation of his interest in community service and government service and serving his country. He influenced, in a great way, my father and my uncles in their lives. The emphasis on serving your country and your community was probably the biggest lesson that he passed on.
Well, I believe we do have a family photograph of the 5 sons and my grandfather, probably taken in the 50s, and there are stories that the uniforms were cut in the back because all of the sons and my grandfather had grown a little and were a little more robust.
All 5 joined up shortly after Pearl Harbor. My father in the Navy, 3 of my uncles in the Army, and 1 of my uncles in the Marine Corps. My brother and I both served in Vietnam in the Marine Corps. In November of 1966, I was in Vietnam and was called home on emergency leave because, coincident with my grandfather's illness or final illness, my father had 2 strokes and they didn't expect him to survive. So I came back from Vietnam, and the day that I got back, the day after I got back, my grandfather died. I didn't see him before he died, but because I was visiting my father. But nevertheless, it was a 3-week break, and then I was back in Vietnam for Christmas. The best times with him were when we were with him at his weekend place up on the Delaware River, when he was quite relaxed and working in his garden and having dinner with all of us every single evening at a large dining room table in a fairly formal manner. But on those occasions, he was relaxed and had time to share some of his experiences and his life with us.